Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar focused on insights, best practices, and expectations for the future of CCS deployment in the United States. The United States has been in the center of attention of the global CCS community as its supportive policies sparked remarkable activities in the CCUS space. Today, we'll hear from the US government and experts on CCS to dive a bit deeper into policies and regulations that drive implementation of CCUS on the ground. My name is Elina Levina, and I'm the Senior Manager of Finance and European Affairs at the Global CCS Institute, and I will be moderating today's discussion. For those of you who may not be familiar with us, the Global CCS Institute is an international think tank with a mission to accelerate deployment of carbon capture and storage, a vital technology needed for tackle climate change and deliver climate neutrality. We have offices around the world in Melbourne, London, Brussels, Washington, DC, Tokyo, Beijing, Abu Dhabi. This webinar is run by colleagues in London and Washington, DC. Today's session will include a presentation from each of our invited speakers, followed by a brief Q&A at the end. You can submit your questions using the Q&A function on the Zoom control panel that you see at the bottom of your screen. In the coming days, a recording of this webinar will be made available on the Institute's website. So the idea of this webinar actually came from questions about CCS in the US that we received from stakeholders in Europe. As European governments and industry are ramping up their efforts to deploy CCS, they look for best practices from the US, where the experience with CCUS is more advanced. More than half of CCUS projects around the world are located in the US. And these questions come not only from Europe, from all over the world, and I'm sure that participants today in this webinar are coming from various parts of the world, not just in the US or Europe. So today we'll hear from our speakers about policies, regulations, legislative frameworks that make such a difference for CCS deployment in the United States. We'll hear about Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, 45Q. We'll also learn about CO2 pipelines in the US and Class 6 well permits. To speak about all of that and more, we're joined today by Stephanie Hudson from the US Department of Energy, Dr. Sally Greenberg, Principal, Sally Greenberg Consulting, Ruth Ivy Moore, my colleague from the Global CCS Institute, and Errol Pinto, another colleague, also from the US, from Global CCS Institute. And first, we'll begin with Stephanie. Stephanie is a management and program analyst, strategic engagement in the Office of Carbon Management at the US DOE. In this role, she supports key bilateral partnerships and participation in multilateral initiatives, such as Clean Energy Ministerial, Mission Innovation, and Carbon Sequestration Leadership Forum. Prior to joining DOE in 2015, Stephanie worked at the US Department of State. Stephanie, thank you very much for being here with us today. We look forward to hearing from you kind of a brief overview of the history of CCS in the US and how government supports CCS deployment in the country. Stephanie, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Alina. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. It's a pleasure to join you all today. Carbon management is certainly a very popular topic these days globally, and especially on both sides of the Atlantic. I just wanted to start this presentation by giving a brief introduction to my office, the Office of Carbon Management, and to kind of give an overview of what we do. Next slide. As you can see here, Fossil Energy became the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management. This new name for our office reflects our new vision to meet the administration's goals of 50% emissions reduction by 2030, CO2 emissions-free power sector by 2035, and a net zero emission economy by no later than 2050. Next slide. As you can see here, our mission is really to support the R&D of critical technologies and infrastructure to manage carbon emissions and reduce the environmental impacts of fossil fuel production and use, with the goal of achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions economy-wide by mid-century, as you just saw in my earlier slide. Next slide. To support this, our office developed a carbon management framework that will guide our engagement with offices across the department, federal agencies, tribal and international governments, industry, non-governmental organizations, and communities. And as you can see here, really the three pillars of this strategic vision that we have set out. Next slide, please. And this builds on a great deal of experience here in DOE and within the US broadly. As you can see, there's over a 40-year history of CCUS RD&D in the US, a lot of this associated originally with EOR. There's a very extensive pipeline CO2 pipeline network in the US, very long-standing efforts to develop the human capital needed to enable CCUS deployment, an excellent R&D program that advances technology and supports policy deployment. And this has culminated in successful major CCUS demonstrations. As of just last month, we have approximately 15.57 million metric tons of CO2 have been captured at our major demonstration projects here in the US. Next slide, please. As an example of some of this work that we've done, I'm just looking here at our DOE carbon capture program over the past 15 years. And as you can see in this slide, our work has moved from first and generation technologies through to transformational technologies, and then eventually to scale up and now explore negative emissions technologies and industrial capture. So in just a matter of 15 years, that you can really note the progress of this specific program that I'm highlighting here. Next slide, please. We also have a robust policy framework, and I know that's going to be what you hear about later on during this webinar, so I won't spend too much time on it. But this really, it's focused around incentives, regulations, and financing. Some of these incentives, a lot of you are familiar with, such as the 45Q tax credit, bipartisan infrastructure law bill, also regulations such as the Environmental Protection Agency's Class 6 underground injection control program. Other agencies, such as Department of Interior, working on CO2 storage on federal land, or the Department of Transportation working on CO2 pipeline safety. To round this off, there's also a great deal of work that's being done right now in our loan program office, including loan guarantees. And a lot of this we also work with the Department of Agriculture on. So it's not just DOE, it's really across the government as a whole. Next slide, please. So I touched on the bipartisan infrastructure law briefly, but this is really a great piece of landmark bill that we have. We have over roughly 12 billion over 5 years for carbon capture, removal, utilization, transportation and storage technologies, as well as direct air capture and hydrogen hubs. And as you can see, this is some of the development that we expect from the 12 billion that we have through grants, loans, and credits. Next slide, please. This slide shows a breakdown of the areas, including point source capture, direct air capture, carbon transport systems, carbon dioxide utilization and storage, and how each one will benefit from this bill funding. As I mentioned earlier, other presenters will cover this in greater depth, but I want to just really show you what this money will really help to accomplish here. Next slide, please. So within DOE as a whole, we're investing in the full suite of carbon management innovation, not just in our office, as I mentioned earlier, but through other offices and our new Office of Clean Energy demonstrations. As you can also see, we're working closely with other offices in DOE, other program offices in DOE, such as the Office of Science, our Loan Programs Office, and Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. So again, it's not just our Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management, it's really a DOE-wide effort. And beyond that, an effort that's really being driven at the federal level with a lot of our sister agencies, but there's also a great deal of work being done at the state and regional level as well. Next slide, please. And I also want to highlight, especially given the nature of our webinar today, that we're not doing this alone. We have an active area of international engagement, as you can see on this slide. This is not an exhaustive list, but it just gives you an idea of some of the examples of our international engagement. One of the key areas is through multilateral initiatives and fora. Bilateral engagement is also a key part of our work, and it really helps to contribute to sharing that knowledge and helping to accelerate the deployment of CCUS and other carbon management technologies globally. Next slide, please. So as I'm wrapping up here, I wanted to quickly share some resources that are available. Again, not an exhaustive list, but I wanted to highlight a few of them, such as our strategic vision, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, our industrial decarbonization roadmap, our carbon matchmaker program, and our justice and engagement planning document and tool for societal considerations and impacts of our FECM projects. I also wanted to note that there are opportunities to engage, not just online, but in person. This August, we have our carbon management project review meeting in Pittsburgh that's held by our National Energy Technology Laboratory. It's an excellent opportunity to learn more about DOE-funded carbon management projects from our R&D programs, including point source carbon capture, carbon dioxide removal, carbon conversion, and carbon transport and storage. That is all from me. So I want to thank you all for your time today, and thank you for the Institute for inviting me to share an update on what we're doing.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, and yeah, for very good remarks. And I think the takeaway message that U.S. government provides really comprehensive support a program for CCS. And it's not only federal government, it's also states, but it's also not just US, but it's international collaboration. So really comprehensive approach to stimulate CCS deployment. So thank you very much for these remarks. And now we'll hear from Dr. Sally Greenberg, principal from Sally Greenberg Consulting. Dr. Sally Greenberg is a scientist and strategic advisor and engagement specialist with over 30 years of experience in the environmental and energy geosciences, who work on diverse climate carbon capture and storage projects, including her time as the principal research scientist on the Illinois-based Decatur project, has made her world-renowned expert. So Sally, could you please dive a bit deeper and give us a broader, a deeper overview of regulatory framework in the US that facilitates CCUS deployment? So over to you, Sally.
Thank you very much, Elena. Very nice to be here today. If I could have the next slide, please. So I want to start my remarks today. Please go back one. Thank you. I want to start my remarks today by just saying that in the United States and elsewhere around the globe, we have, over the course of the last couple of decades, demonstrated the safe and effective viability of carbon capture and storage. And as we have marched through time, the pieces of this puzzle have come together. And what we're seeing in the United States and what we're all here to talk about today is really what happens when you have prolonged engagement on solving a particular challenge, not only on your home shores, but around the world. And as Stephanie mentioned, the international collaborations that we have had in the United States have certainly fueled us in our efforts to move forward. And one of the ways that we know that the pieces have come together and the way that I have noticed change over time is simply in the way that we talk about the various pieces of carbon capture and storage. We, in 2003, talked a lot about barriers, technical and non-technical barriers. As we started to progress to demonstration projects in the United States, we focused on obstacles and then challenges. And finally, we had some very major successes, which have allowed us to move forward to deployment. Now we're taking another whole round and looking at what the impacts and the equity implications are. So the way that I see this is not that the challenges or the concepts have changed, but simply as we get deeper and deeper into the development and implementation of carbon capture, utilization, and storage, that we peel the layers of an onion and we peel one set of challenges and then the next comes along. And it's really a deepening of our understanding and our ability to challenge those. And I believe that that's the challenge that the United States has met and continues to meet. So next slide, please. I refer back to a National Petroleum Council study that was published in 2019, and I don't intend for you to read all of this, but I'd like to look at the highlighted, bolded recommendation from this report, and that is to achieve carbon capture utilization deployment at scale. The US government will need to reduce uncertainty on existing incentives, establish adequate additional incentives, and implement a durable regulatory and legal environment that drives industry investment. So that is, in summary, what I am going to describe to you today, because before this recommendation was made, but certainly in the intervening 4 years since this publication came out, that's exactly what's been happening. So next slide, please. We have several policies in place, and I took the opportunity to look up what policy is defined as, and it's a course or a principle of action adopted or proposed by a government, a party, a business, or an individual. So the federal government, through our regular appropriations process, has devoted funding to the U.S. Department of Energy, Department of Interior, and other agencies from the year 2000 until the present. They've instituted tax credits. When you hear 45Q, that's the actual tax code that we use as sort of shorthand. It was implemented in 2008 and enhanced in 2022, which we'll talk about. And then some key legislation, the Use It Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and the Inflation Reduction Act. Next. So starting with the Use It Act in 2020, the law amended the Clean Air Act to direct the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, to support carbon utilization and direct air capture. It clarifies that CCUS projects and pipelines are eligible for streamlined permitting review, directed the White House Council of Environmental Quality to establish guidance and expedite the development of CCUS facilities and pipelines, and directed the CEQ to establish 2 task forces looking at the potential for streamlining pipeline. Those task forces have just been put in place and will be starting their work very soon. There also are task force established to hear input from impacted stakeholders with regard to implementing CCS. Next slide, please. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, which was passed in November of 2021, includes more than $62 billion specifically for DOE to deliver more equitable energy future to the American people. There's $12 billion specifically for carbon management investments over the 5 years, and I have a breakdown of that here. Again, I don't want to read them. These numbers are outlined in Stephanie's slides as well, but you can see that we're looking at everything from demonstration projects to pilot projects to validation and testing to infrastructure finance and innovation, shoring up and putting additional resources into the EPA's well permitting program, the underground injection control program, looking at front-end engineering design studies for capture and transport, utilization, direct air capture, and commercial technology prizes, and also student prizes. So a lot of funding going towards a variety of different programs, and also the standing up of a new office at the Department of Energy. So now we have 2 offices at the Department of Energy. One is the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management, which Stephanie represents, and the other is the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations, where several of these large new demonstration projects will be administered from. Next slide. The Inflation Reduction Act introduces another set of investments that will lower energy costs for family and businesses. And this one is important because it it amends the 45Q tax credit, moving from $35 and $50 a ton to $85 and $180 a ton, depending on the type of capture and storage. If you move to the next slide, please, I have a breakdown. This is the details of the enhancements. So an increase in the cost of per ton paid for carbon storage. It allows demonstration projects, direct air capture, and other projects to be funded, reduces the amount of CO2 that needs to be captured and stored for a project to be eligible, and most importantly, includes a 7-year begin to construct extension that allows projects to begin construction between now and the end of 2032 in order to be eligible for the tax credit. Next. So this is a slide I thought I was going to see, and this shows the progression or the changes of the 45Q. So you can see at the beginning or in the middle, it was $35 a ton for enhanced oil recovery. Now that's $60. It was $50 a ton for industrial carbon dioxide. Now it's $85. Direct air capture went from $35 a ton to $130, and capture facilities from 50 tons to $50 to 180 tons. So you can see it's enough of a significant investment that it has fueled and catalyzed the American environment for storing carbon dioxide. Next slide, please. And I wanted to show a little bit of the impact. So you can just see here is 2018 to 2022, the number of projects and is increasing, and the type of project by sector is increasing. Next slide, please. And then here's a visual. That slide and the next two slides are from the Clean Air Task Force. They have an interactive CCUS map online, which is really interesting. This is from a presentation I gave in 2020, a screenshot that I did. This is the United States. Take note of the number of projects, the type of projects. There's 4 different sectors and essentially the volumes. Now, next slide, please. This I took yesterday or the day before, and you can see a considerable difference in the number of projects, the type of sector, and just the location and implication of what the incentives with policy and regulation clarity has brought to just the United States. And I highly encourage you to view the time-lapse view on the Clean Air Task Force website, because it shows just over the course of these 5 years how the projects have developed. Next slide, please. I want to say a little bit in the time that I have remaining about regulations, which are also critical to our ability to safely store carbon dioxide. We have a federal program. The figure on the left shows the regions of the Environmental Protection Agency. We have we're increasing states who are seeking primacy, which means regulatory control from the federal government. And several states have introduced legislation in the last year or two, which should either enable or further regulate our ability to safely store carbon dioxide. Next slide, please. So what we see in culmination really is that we've developed a very robust landscape. And I'd like to give a shout out to my colleague, Richard Esposito from Southern Company, for lending me his slide. But we see policy incentives. We see risk and uncertainty being reduced. I wouldn't say it's completely there yet, but we're in the process of trying to remove as much, mitigate for risk using our best vehicle, which is the Class 6 regulatory framework, but also getting some clarity and some ability to have known timelines. We see a huge investment from Congress, but exceptional management of these programs from the Department of Energy and a focus on carbon management. We continue to see new federal agencies looking at the Bureau of Offshore Management and Bessie and Department of Interior, all of these agencies coming together in interagency working groups to determine the ways in which they need to operate in order to enable carbon capture and storage. And then lastly, we see advancements in education, equity and justice, workforce development, and stakeholder engagement, all of which are critical components to the carbon capture and storage picture in the United States. And with that, I'll close my remarks.
Thank you so much, Sally. A really fascinating story and really important lessons learned from the US situation, that regulatory clarity together with support, together with durability of policies could actually make a huge difference for industry and make it comfortable for them to start investing in large and expensive projects like CCS. So I have a lot of questions in my mind, but I'm sure our audience will also have a lot of questions for you when we come to the Q&A session. But now let me pass it on to my colleague in the Global CCS Institute, Ruth Ivy Moore. Ruth is the Institute Policy and Advocacy Manager for the Americas. Ruth has more than 20 years of experience across energy, chemical, and nonprofit sectors. Her broad areas of expertise include sustainability, corporate social responsibility, ESG, climate change, energy policy, and law. In her current role, she leads the Institute's America's advocacy efforts. So we'll switch gears a little bit now, and we'll talk about CO2 pipelines. As Stephanie mentioned in her presentation, there are more than 8,000 miles of CO2 pipelines in the US. So we receive a lot of questions about that. You know, are there any standards? Are there any concerns, like safety concerns? Are there any regulations for pipelines? So I'm sure Ruth will shed some light for us about this topic right now. So Ruth, over to you.
Thanks, Elena. And I'll go to the next slide. Okay, thank you. As has been mentioned before, there are about over 8,000 kilometer pipelines, CO2 pipelines a year, which equates to about over 5,000 miles. And pipeline is really deemed to be the most efficient way of transporting. And with the supportive policy that Sally has talked about, and also Stephanie talked about, what we're expecting to see is there can be a significant ramp up of pipeline deployment, which is really needed. According to a Princeton University study, suggests that we will need a total of about 66,000 miles of pipeline, CO2 pipeline, by 2050. So to get there, we will need wide-scale deployment of CCS pipelines across the US, and it will require an expansion of the existing CO2 pipeline infrastructure through looping, replacement, or other engineering modification, as well as construction of new pipeline. And this is going to require a lot more capital, probably in excess of 170 billion. Next slide. And as Elena mentioned, and I know a lot of question relates to CO2 is safety. Safety and siting are key areas that have to be addressed regarding pipelines. While CO2 has been safely and reliably transported in the US for the last 50 years with no fatalities associated with the transportation of the carbon dioxide rail pipeline, there still are concerns from the public about the safety. And although CO2 is listed as a non-flammable gas, under the Department of Transportation, the US Department of Transportation's Pipeline and Hazardous Material Administration, PHMSA, regulates CO2 in these pipelines. PHMSA regulates the safety requirements for the pipelines, similar to the way they regulate the pipelines for other hazardous liquids such as crude oil and also anhydrous ammonia. PHMSA is responsible for regulating the movements of all hazardous material, and it sets the standards for safe construction, operation of these pipelines, including the technical design, specification, and requirements for mechanical integrity, management, and emergency response. The states can act as the pipeline regulator if at a minimum their regulations comply with federal regulations. The majority of CO2 pipeline siting, however, is dependent upon state law. PHMSA did announce in May of last year a rulemaking to update its CO2 pipeline safety standards, and it's a research solicitation to study the impact of CO2 pipeline releases. Next slide. Siting is really the most complicated in the US. There really is no one federal agency to regulate siting. States play a lead role in the economic regulation of CO2 pipelines and in regulating pipeline siting on non-federal lands. States shape where pipelines are sited and how developers acquire rights of way, or ROW. In order to build a pipeline, developers must meet any state requirement for siting approval and acquire right-of-ways along the pipeline path from landowners in the form of purchase easements. In the case where a landowner does not want to sell an easement, pipeline developers may exercise eminent domain in states where it is allowed to acquire the property. Various states do allow eminent domain in certain circumstances to enable acquisition of property by the government or a government-defined party for public use. States that allow the exercise of eminent domain for these type pipelines do so only if such pipelines have common carrier status. Common carrier status usually includes requirements that a pipeline is available for public use and can be accessed and used by other parties and allows the states to become involved with setting tariffs. Aside from common carrier status, public notice is also a requirement. Even in states that do provide domain authority, eminent domain authority, it is controversial in nature, so it is really used as a last resort. In terms of economic regulations for CO2 pipelines, is commonly built on between a contractual relationship basis between the relevant parties. If a dispute does arise between these parties, the states would have the authority to hear the complaints for intrastate pipelines. For interstate pipelines, it's not clear who has the actual authority, but some have suggested that the Federal Surface Transportation Board, STB, does have potential to play that role under certain frameworks. Should a pipeline developer seek to cross federal lands, another nuance is added. The Bureau of Land Management can grant a right-of-way under the Mineral Leasing Act or the Federal Land Policy and Management Act. A right-of-way granted under the MLA, the Mineral Leasing Act, imposes certain common carrier status on the pipeline. A pipeline crossing federal land does trigger National Environmental Protection Act, NEPA, which requires either an environmental impact statement or an environmental assessment to be conducted. Next slide, please. With all this, there are still concerns that have to be addressed by the public. So expanding pipelines require engagement with the communities early on to address these concerns and to have a much better time in getting the pipeline sited. Some of the community concerns fall into primarily three buckets. Not in my backyard. Communities are not keen to have CO2 pipelines laid in their area. Safety. Communities are concerned about the safety of pipelines. However, a lot of the concerns seem to be spread through word of mouth and may not be based on fact. Extending the life of fossil fuels. This is a distant third cause of after not in my backyard and safety. However, it is one that is used by some groups to catalyze opposition to pipeline. Last slide. So we encourage, in addition to the regulatory complexity, particularly across different states, we encourage developers to engage with communities proactively. That is, identify and utilize the right messengers, incorporate due diligence to thoroughly understand the communities, encourage operators to devise means of community engagement very early on in the process, develop educational material to familiarize the entities, the public with CO2, and identify and disseminate existing resources. And I just want to thank you for being here. This is all I have.
Yep, thank you very much, Ruth. Yeah, quite interesting to hear that despite such a regulatory complexity, there is such a broad network of pipelines. So interesting. Well, let us now move on to my other colleague in the United States, Errol Pinto. Errol is the Senior Consultant Policy and Commercial and in the Institute. Errol is an energy sector expert skilled across the energy value chain with competences in natural resource development, policy, strategy, and project delivery. Prior to joining the Institute, Errol worked in the private sector for nearly 20 years at international energy companies and brings an insider's working knowledge of energy and climate policy in support of energy transition. So Errol, as CCUS technology matures and more projects are looking for permanent storage for CO2, there's a lot of attention to the Class 6 well permits in the US. So we receive lots of questions about that, what the process to obtain Class 6 permit, how does the permit look like? Are there any provisions for financial security or long-term liability? So over to you to answer some of these questions.
Yeah, thanks, Alina. Appreciate the opportunity to share some of my thoughts on this, and we can certainly dive into some of these questions. Hopefully, we can get a better understanding of what the landscape looks like right now. This is a very pressing topic, as you mentioned. There are lots of questions that we receive. So without further ado, let's go to the next slide. So before we get into what Class 6 wells are, a bit of framing around where we are right now. And we heard from previous presentations that we need to have an effective framework around how activity is governed under any jurisdiction, and the effectiveness of any legislation is enabled by effective commercial and regulatory frameworks. These kind of underpin the activity that we see, not just in the United States, but in many other jurisdictions around the world. And CCS policy fits into this because it could ultimately feed into net zero and NDC commitments, international agreements that countries have with each other, and also in multilateral jurisdictions like the EU. So how does storage fit into all this? Well, so we saw a couple of slides in earlier presentations on the Inflation Reduction Act. The Inflation Reduction Act and the increases in the 45Q tax credits address geological storage. So you can see how policy intersects with legislation. In this presentation, we'll be covering not only how legislation at the national level affects activity, but also how it impacts the subnational level in the United States. So Class 6 primacy, for example, is an application of a subnational regulatory framework. In a new and upcoming sector like the CCS sector it's a burgeoning sector, policy clarity tends to have a much bigger impact than in a mature sector. Mature sectors tend to have inertia from activities that they've conducted in the past, and that helps them move forward. But in a new sector or a growing sector, policy clarity is extremely important and supports activity. Private sector uncertainty tends to be sourced from seemingly overlapping policies, legislations, rules, and regulations. So we'll take a look at how some of these policy frameworks, at least for Class 6 wells, can provide confidence to stakeholders. Next slide, please. So before we get into what's in Class 6 policy, let's take a look at at a very high level, what's outside of it. The CCS value chain has many different activities, and not all of them are covered under the Class 6 framework. For example, carbon capture technology, the actual technology used to capture the carbon, is not. Monitoring, reporting, and verification, parts of it are addressed under the Class 6, but overall, there is a separate approval process that organizations have to go through to get that approval from the EPA. CO2 transportation, as we saw in the previous presentation, falls under PHMSA's jurisdiction. PHMSA is a different agency under the federal government that governs interstate pipelines. Pore space and mineral rights, they are very nuanced in the United States, and they vary state by state. The Institute has done a publication on pore space rights in the United States. So I'd recommend our listeners to take a look at that publication if they're interested. Next slide. So what is the Class 6 program? At a very high level, the Class 6 program is part of what's called the Underground Injection Control Program, and it is managed by the Environmental Protection Agency, which is a federal government level agency in the United States. It has a nearly 13-year history, so it's had a fairly long run, starting in about the end of 2010, which is when the EPA established a new well class, and it's called Class 6. It came into effect about 270 days later in 2011, and that duration initially was for states to apply for primary enforcement responsibility, and this is what's commonly referred to as primacy, and this is the subnational level of the framework that I was alluding to in an earlier slide. A couple of states, North Dakota and Wyoming, already have Class 6 primacy. They obtained it back in 2018 and 2020, respectively. And most recently, just last month, the EPA determined that the state of Louisiana's Class 6 program meets all requirements for approval. So they're very close or almost there when it comes to attaining Class 6 primacy. And we'll see in a few slides further down that there are other states that are also seeking this primacy approval. So what's different with Class 6? Like other well classes, this rule, the Class 6 rule, establishes minimum technical criteria to protect underground sources of drinking water. But unlike the other well classes, it addresses the impact of the long-term storage of CO2, which is why it's important for this discussion. Next slide, please. So here's a schematic. Some who are listening may have already seen this schematic, but it's a very informative, visual, powerful one. It demonstrates, what a Class 6 well would do in terms of storage, where it would store the CO2, and its relevance with regard to the underground sources of drinking water, which are much shallower. And as we discussed earlier, the underground injection control program is run by the EPA. There are other well classes that the EPA administers under the UIC program. It's not just the Class 6. There are classes 1 through 5, and each of these well classes address different wells for different uses, and it's only the Class 6 wells that address the geologic sequestration of carbon dioxide, which is why there is a huge amount of relevance to CCS and a lot of discussion around how Class 6 wells are permitted and which states have primacy, and also how states can obtain primacy for Class 6 well permit requirements. You'll notice here that the Class 2 wells, oil and gas related injection wells, those are, sometimes we get questions regarding how, Class 2 versus Class 6. And Class 2 wells are strictly for, oil and gas related injection. They don't address CO2 as the fluid that will be sequestered. Next slide. And Class 6 wells, like other wells, have a certain set of minimum technical criteria, as we mentioned in the previous slide. And what do they cover? They cover all the areas that would impact the design and construction of the well itself. So the permitting is a big part of it. The site characterization and the geology, The area of review, financial responsibility is a big one because it touches on long-term liability. The actual well construction itself, the construction of the asset that will be used to dispose of the CO2, the operation of that facility, the operation of that well, mechanical integrity testing and monitoring. This component of the minimum technical criteria is related to the MRV that requires separate approval from the EPA that we spoke about earlier. And then finally, there's the well plugging, post-injection site care, and site closure, which is also a big component of the technical criteria. North Dakota and Wyoming, which already have primacy, have defined technical criteria separately because they have primacy. And their technical criteria are in keeping with what the EPA also has, which is why they have primacy. This graphic, just like the graphic that we saw on the previous slide, they're both sourced from the EPA and a couple of the presentations that the EPA has put out here in the recent past. I'm using it here because it's a visual description of the well itself, where the well would be with respect to the water table, which is what the underground sources of drinking water would be referred to, and where the CO2 would actually be disposed of. It also gives an understanding of what underground faulting could do for the migration of CO2, what a confining layer would be, so on and so forth. So it's an interesting graphic, and I thought it would add to this discussion. Next slide, please. So here's a very broad overview from the EPA with some additional color from the states. Currently, the EPA has 77 permits under varying stages of evaluation that they've disclosed on their website. There are 2 active, there are 74 pending, and there's 1 that's been withdrawn. North Dakota has about 5 permits that they've issued, and Wyoming has 3. When it comes to permitting, the EPA lists guidance documents that are very detailed, and they list out the permit application criteria in a fair amount of detail. There's a checklist, and there's also an outline which cross-references all the requirements that the EPA has for each category of technical criteria that they're seeking information on. So there's guidance, there's a checklist, and there's a permit application outline that can be referred to. There's also the permits themselves for the CCS number 1 and CCS number 2 wells that were issued to ADM. And these permits are worth looking at. They are available to the public, and they can be compared against EPA's requirements. And it's an interesting read because it would provide guidance on what it took to actually get a permit that's approved for each of those wells. When it comes to monitoring, the Class 6 wells need to be monitored for a 50-year time frame after ceasing the injection activities. This is after the injection activities cease. And they are project dependent, the monitoring requirements, including the frequency, and there's guidance on that for each area of the project development process, which can be referred to again through the EPA. And for the states, they have their own requirements. Wyoming and North Dakota that have attained primacy. Existing wells. So we hear often that there are there are existing wells in the United States. Many, in fact, the EIA, the U.S. agency that collects data on wells, I think at the end of 2022, it was reported that the total number of wells in the United States, at least for oil and gas, are in excess of about 900,000. These are all wells all across the United States, onshore and offshore. So there are many existing wells, and what would it take for some of these existing wells to be repurposed, so to speak, for Class VI usage? Well, they would need to be re-permitted, and they would need to meet Class VI requirements. So it's almost like going through a permit for a new well, except in this case there would be the mechanical integrity related questions that would come to bear and would have significant impact on the re-permitting of that well. There's guidance on well construction, and there's also a couple of CFRs that address Class VI re-permitting. And then finally, there's EPA guidance, which is exhaustive. All of it can be found on EPA's Class VI website, including the permit applications and the guidance documents that we have just spoken to. Next slide. So as we mentioned, states are interested in obtaining Class VI primacy. Arizona, Texas, and West Virginia are in progress. Several other states have shown interest. This interest is indicative of the importance of CCS as a decarbonization strategy, but it's also important to note that interstate collaboration would be important. As we've seen on previous slides, transportation and storage is a big potential area of collaboration. CCS has challenges. It's assumed to be niche, but has a long history of demonstration. The Institute recently at the DC Forum addressed some of these issues in a panel session, so I'd recommend to our listeners to take a look at that. Community engagement and environmental justice are also important considerations, as we heard in the previous presentation, and I'd recommend that our listeners take a look at the panel session on environmental justice from the Institute's DC Forum from last year. With that, thank you, Elena.
Yep. Thank you very much, Errol, for these insights and very detailed overview of Class VI wells. There are a couple of questions coming in, so I'll ask you a bit later, but I would like to maybe start our Q&A session with Stephanie. I know, Stephanie, you need to leave pretty soon. So just one question for you, I think kind of a more strategic view. What's your overall assessment of the situation with CCS and how things are developing in the US? And what's the government's ambition for CCS? Should we expect more on CCS? Should we kind of understand, should we expect a longer term also regulation and strategy in the US for CCS?
Thanks for the question, Alina. So I think in the US, things are moving at a pretty fast clip, as you saw in Sally's slides. The difference in the projects that have been announced on the Clean Air Task Force map, it really shows you could just see it for yourself that there's been a lot of kind of energy that's been accelerated by a lot of the announcements that have been made or new laws that have come in. So I think the environment is very favorable right now for CCUS development in the US as a whole. I think, as I mentioned in my presentation and Sally mentioned as well, between bill, IRA, and other incentives, we are really working hard to help accelerate that deployment of CCUS while working together with states and with others. It's not just the government. But I know, just an example of something, we noted all of the sort of, the figures that are associated with the bill. But, for example, we're expecting these programs to support between 65 and 100 million tons of additional carbon capture capacity in the US. So that's, based on our current capacity, that's tripling or quadrupling it. And then we're expecting about 20 to 40 storage hubs with over 2 billion tons of commercial storage capacity. And that's coupled with up to 100 Class VI geologic storage wells, then that can inject 100 million tons of carbon each year. So we see a lot happening and a lot of ambition I think, as we've always, we've had a long history at DOE of supporting CCUS and R&D, and I expect that will continue, not just in our office, but again, it's going to be a multi-office process and multi-agency. So I think that probably answers the question a bit.
Yep. Thank you very much. Thank you for these remarks, and a very ambitious program in the US for CCS. So I think a lot of listeners here are probably very excited to hear about that. There is a question in the chat about 45Q, maybe for Sally or Stephanie, feel free to jump on that as well. Whether there is any risk that it will change over years.
So thank you, Alina. Interesting question. 45Q is enacted through congressional activities, so is not subject to changes in administration. It's law, and it's part of the US tax code. So new legislation would have to be enacted in order to change the current program for 45Q.
Yep, thanks a lot, Sally. That clarifies a lot the situation. There are a couple of questions about class 6 wells and how to speed it up, and also the question was about the role of states. And Errol, you mentioned that several states received primacy. Does it mean the process will speed up for class 6 well permits? And also broader, what is the role of states in CCS deployment in the US? I mean, other speakers feel free to answer that question as well, but maybe we'll start with Errol.
Yeah, thank you, Alina. So the role of states is important. Each state in the United States, especially along the Gulf Coast, where I have a fair amount of experience, and other states as well that have had oil and gas developments in the past, have a very good understanding of their in-state geology and the impact of in-state geology on potential production and also injection. So the role of the states is important because they are able to, under their own laws, to be able to permit and regulate activity within the states. And they're also able to dedicate state agencies and state resources exclusively to this task. In terms of how it would impact development, that's a complicated question because it depends on the level of complexity of the projects themselves. The projects moving, the EPA granting primacy to the states can certainly increase the activity in that state, but at this point it's not really clear as to how quickly each application would be processed because as we've seen, every CCS application tends to be very specific. It has its own project complexities. How it's evaluated is going to be something each agency will have to tackle for themselves. So it's an it depends type answer.
Great. Thank you. Sally and Ruth, are there any comments on the role of states broader in the CCS deployment?
Go ahead, Sally.
I just want to say something quickly, and that is that the states do have an important role to play. The places where we see things accelerating amongst the states are places where the state energy policy, the regulatory framework, and the objectives of the state are aligned. And so to the extent that that alignment is happening, that's where you see acceleration. The other thing I'd like to say is that state primacy is not the necessarily the solution to what some people feel are extended timelines for permitting. So that is not the solution. It may be in some states, and in other states, it is not.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I'd just like to add to that is that there are a lot of issues related to in deployment of CCS, and the states do hold is the kingpin here. you know, as I mentioned in my talk, that pipeline, laying of the pipeline, that's dependent upon each state. And then not only each state, but you have to delve down into the county level, you know, with siting issues. But also in the US, pore space, as Errol alluded to in his remark, pore space is not really defined, is not really clarified who owns a pore space in certain states. Some states and then one state like Texas has differing opinions of who owns the pore space. So that's an issue. In addition to that, long-term storage, longevity, long stewardship, who's going to handle that? So states have a significant role to play here. You know, history just shows that if a state does get problems with North Dakota, but again, it does depend on the situation, the geology, and everything else. You know, North Dakota was able to issue a permit and a Class 6 permit in about a year or so, okay? Versus, you know, getting one out of EPA. EPA is now looking to issue permits in a much shorter time span based on some resources they're getting from the IRA and the bipartisan infrastructure law. So it's a very complicated question. So like Errol said, it does depend, but states play a key role in CCS deployment.
Yeah, thank you very much. We're running a little bit over time, but let me ask 2 more questions, and thank you our speakers for your willingness to stay a bit longer. What is your, and maybe we'll start with Sally, but other speakers, please join in as well. What is your overall assessment of the evolution of policies in the US and the effect on CCS? Sally, you've mentioned that in your presentation, but maybe what's the next step as well, like how you see things evolving? And the second question is about public perception. We have some issues of that in Europe, especially for the onshore storage. Are there any issues with public perception with onshore storage in the US? So 2 questions.
So I think that we will continue to see the landscape evolving in the United States. I think the next step is to really see the impact of this unprecedented amount of federal funding that is going towards projects and the continued meeting and addressing of challenges and opportunities that come along with the actual activity of putting forward a project and working with communities and other stakeholders. And I think any new legislation or incentives or additional actions will make themselves evident through the course of that process. With respect to public perception, so this is something I could talk for a very long time about, as could Ruth. So I won't, but I'll say that, you know, anytime we do anything that involves human beings and their livelihood and their homes and their identity and their well-being, of course, there is an impact with the public. And what we see happening in the United States is that those conversations are getting more sophisticated, deeper, more challenging, but are ever present and ever more necessary to really have hard conversations about what it is that we want as a society and how we enact those goals and objectives. And so that's where the public discourse is happening in the United States.
Yep. Thank you very much, Sally. Ruth, would you like to add anything to both questions?
Yeah, there's really not a lot to add. I think Sally summed it up very well. You know, looking at public perception, you know, you're dealing with a number of different things. But what we're seeing is that there, every time as we get closer to, you know, 2030, where we need to be in 2030 on the global goals, and also in 2050, we are seeing some shift in that public perception of some of the, you know, kind of left-leaning ideologies are now starting to understand that CCS is not just for the proliferation of oil and gas, but it is to help those large and private sectors. But that's going to take some time to get over that hurdle. For its community, the best thing I can say is that developers need to be engaged very much upfront. It's got to be a proactive and not a secondary thought. And then for us, you know, activity in the states are in different phases. You know, California's in the phase from what Texas is and for Louisiana. So, you know, again, understanding where the jurisdiction that governs that storage or that pipeline land is going to be key. And each state is at a different stage.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ruth. There was a strange background noise, at least for me, like a little robot was repeating what you were saying, but I don't know if others heard the same. But so Errol, anything to add to the answer to these two questions?
Yeah, I'd say, the one thing that I'd add is that at least when it comes to, Class 6 development, there's been some clarity on which, agency addresses it. So like in the US, we have the EPA, which has traditionally been the federal agency that addresses it. So there's clarity there. When there's overlapping agencies that address one aspect of policy, it can lead to confusion from the private sector. And we've talked about this in other segments of this webinar, but the importance of transportation networks is going to be key. Pipeline development is going to be key. As we learned, we have about 5,000 miles of pipeline in the United States. Contrast that with the natural gas pipeline network, there are millions of miles. So in order to meet CCS related goals, I'm not saying that the pipeline network needs to grow to that level, but there's huge scope to be able to increase interstate collaboration when it comes to CO2 transportation.
Yep, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you all. It's been an insightful session. I think we'll wrap it up now. Thank you very much, our speakers. Thank you very much to the audience for being with us today. If you would like to learn more about CCS, both in the US and globally, you can visit our website. There are lots of reports there, including our global status CCS report, free to download. We're working right now on the 2023 version, which will be available in the fall. Also, we're on social media. You can see on the screen how to get in touch with us. If you have additional questions about US or any other country about CCS development, please don't hesitate to send us questions through email that is on your screen. And I think with that, we'll close the webinar. Again, big thank you to all our speakers and for staying a bit longer. And thank you for the audience. And goodbye. We'll finish here.